You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by me, Jay Requard, and my father, Jake Requard. This Star Trek The Next Generation fan cast is made for my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great fans out there that we're putting them out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay. What about you?
I'm doing well. I think we have a good episode to talk about. We're discussing the Samaritan Snare, the Samaritan Snare, which is season 2, episode 17, which debuted on March 15th, 1989. I think that on one hand, this is a classic Star Trek episode because it has a lot of the kind of the fun campiness of the original series. But on the other hand, it has some really interesting philosophical depth to it that I think is unique to the Next Generation. And I really enjoy this episode on many levels. What do you think about it?
Um, I thought it was a fun episode too. Yeah, it's a good comment about kind of the Pakleds are such a strange species that it kind of does go back to you know original series when first were started to expose to some of the different species that they encountered.
Right. Well, they remind me a little bit of the Tellarites, just in terms of their physical complexion. Like they're kind of big and doughy, but they also have a very unique facial features to them. Um, before we dig into the episode, let's talk about the Pakleds for a little bit. Very interesting enemies. I like the idea that they portray themselves to be stupid and they actually trick the crew for a little bit into believing that. Um, I'm a little disappointed we only see them once, but on the other hand, it's good because I'm not sure that this is a foe or even characters that you can bring back in the long term, like the Ferengis. I think the Ferengis are much more usable than the Pakleds for writing interesting Star Trek stories.
They're interesting in that they are smart, as they would say it, but
Yes.
as they are described, they are very much copiers. And when they say that we looking for things, we're finding things, they really are. Part of my notes is this are kind of space pirates in a way, and their shtick is sort of to come across as stupid and unintelligent, but it ends up being a ploy on their part. But I think at some point during the episode they're described as being culturally immature. I think
Right.
that's a good description.
Well,
And the last thing I say about them is that at the towards the end, the other story is Picard having to have his uh, prosthetic or artificial heart replaced, so that once they get clear of the Pakleds, they need to get to the starbase, get Dr. Pulaski there to
mm-hmm.
save Picard. And it's like, well, when are you going to go back and slap the Pakleds for the shit they've been pulling on everybody?
You know
You're
what?
letting them get away with murder, guys.
The interesting thing about the Pakleds to me is that we don't often discuss in Star Trek the possibility of alien races or civilizations out there that aren't necessarily part of the Federation, aren't necessarily part of any greater community, or maybe not even the Pakleds may not even have their own planet. but they have access to like weapons and warp drive. There might be a lot of species out there in the Star Trek universe that aren't that we don't even see, that are strange and unique to themselves, or beautiful and unique to themselves, but they are, like you said, the space pirates or the intertents of the galaxy a little bit. Like they're the tinkers and the cobblers. They're kind of the, I don't want to use the word. They're the caravanners a little
Yeah,
bit.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that that's just an interesting thing because we really don't tell a lot of stories about those kind of cultures, because they're very prevalent throughout Europe and stuff like that. And there's a lot of depictions sometimes of like caravanners or gypsy cultures of being kind of this level of unintelligent, or they kind of take things and assume them on their own. But there is a real kind of cultural. I'm trying to look. I think the cultures out there that are kind of nomadic really have an ability to endure and adapt in ways that landed civilizations don't. Particularly, I'm thinking about like the Mongols today in modern Mongolia. Um, they went from being this huge, gigantic empire that almost conquered half of the known world and in large parts Asia, and had huge cultural contributions. But even today, they're still living a nomadic lifestyle in Mongolia, even though they have like um, vested cities. Like I think their capital is Ulaanbaatar.
Yes, right.
Um,
I actually read an
but
article where they're becoming less nomadic. They're more. A lot of them are
right,
moving into the capital city. Yeah.
well, it's interesting because I look at a lot of Mongolian cultural stuff on YouTube for some things that I'm working on, but also because I find like their horsemanship and their bow stuff, and particularly their cooking, to be very, very interesting. But there's a certain ruggedness to their culture, to that nomadic culture, where they're, even though they might be moving into their cities, they're going to be able to maintain a cultural identity that I don't think a lot of civilizations are able to maintain because they settled themselves. And I think that that's just maybe an interesting
Sure.
observation to make
Sure.
about our anthropological situation in general.
Right.
But
Right.
but let's dig into the episode real quick
Go
and
ahead.
get people up to speed. So, as you mentioned, the USS Enterprise D is en route to the Epsilon 4. No, is that Epsilon 9?
Epsilon 9,
Sorry.
I think. Yeah.
Sorry, for some reason I saw that and I was like, that's a 4. Epsilon 9 sector for an astronomical survey of the Epsilon pulsar cluster. Captain Picard is having a discussion with Pulaski about his artificial heart, which needs to be replaced at Starbase 515. This works out because Wesley Crusher also needs to go to Starbase 515 to take his Starfleet entrance exams for the Academy. Pulaski initially proposed performing the procedure on board the Enterprise along with her medical staff, but Picard refuses, being concerned about his image with the crew as its captain. Uh, so, digging into this, Wesley and Picard are going to go off on a shuttle excursion to Starbase 515. I think it's like a 6-hour journey where
Right.
they have
Yeah. Yeah.
a very interesting conversation, which is a storyline to itself. Um, we said we had two storylines in this episode. There's really three, Eh, but the first one we'll identify as the Picard and Wesley one, and we'll put that off to the side. The second one is the story of Riker taking over the crew and running into the Pakleds, and we've mentioned them. The third one that I think we should get into right now and just get through quickly is Pulaski's interaction with Worf. Because early on in the episode, and this is literally like a 6-minute storyline, it felt like. And I watched it a couple times, and they gave it, I think, really about 6 minutes, but they give it real focus at the beginning of of the episode. So Worf comes in the sick bay and he's having the sniffles and chills and a fever, and Pulaski runs a test on him, and he basically has the equivalent of Klingon measles. And because of his warrior ethic and identity, he's aghast at the idea that he would come down with a children's illness. So Pulaski, when asked by Picard what's wrong with Worf, covers for him by saying that he had been attempting a Klingon ritual where he had been fasting and had forgotten to lower his physical activity as he lowered his caloric intake, thankfully covering for Worf and protecting his honor. In thanks, Worf performs a Klingon tea ceremony for Pulaski later on in sickbay. Literally, God, it feels like the scene after the next. They really zip this up really quick. I wanted to ask, what did you think about the Klingon tea ceremony? It felt distinctly Japanese. It felt so out of character for the Klingons in a way.
I have a question. Did this show up in this episode, or is it show up
Yes,
in the next one?
no, it shows up in this episode. It
Does it?
literally happens at the very
Okay.
beginning
Right.
of
Right.
It's at the beginning of the episode.
Um, I just think that it. Hold on. Let me look at something. I think that I wrote some notes about it, and that Dr. Pulaski still uses HIPAA. HIPAA has stayed around because she keeps Worf's condition confidential because he would be embarrassed by having a pediatric Klingon
Oh,
disease.
Dad, you are absolutely correct. I am wrong. That storyline's from Up the Long Ladder, which is the next
Yes,
episode.
right, right.
Everyone, just ignore me. I am very tired, and I blended episodes together. We'll
We'll
talk
save
about
that.
that next time.
Yeah, exactly,
So
exactly.
sorry about that.
It's all right.
Okay, so let's get back into the two main storylines. Excuse me, I
But
need a sip of
but
water. I have the vapors.
vapors. But to kind of pick up is that uh, Picard doesn't want Pulaski to do the surgery on the ship because he has concern over his image. He wants to be seen as invincible and so forth. He doesn't want to be the subject of Starfleet gossip, which he figures might happen when he goes to Starbase 515 and has the surgery done there. And then the
Can I jump in real quick
yeah, go ahead, sure.
and discuss the premise of this here? Because, like I said, I enjoy this episode, but ultimately this serves to kind of be a bullshit premise. Because Pulaski's later identified to kind of be the best cardiac surgeon, at
Yes,
least in the sector.
right.
And like you just said, like he's worried about Starfleet knowing about this or becoming gossip. Like, why not keep it on the ship in the privacy of sickbay with the best cardiac surgeon who
Right.
says that she can do it anyway?
And his decision making is so silly, for lack of a better term, is that since he elects to not have it done on the ship and have it done on the starbase, and they run into complications, and the who it is that the specialist comes in and says, look, there's
Right.
only one person I know of who can take care of this, and it's Dr. Pulaski. So but since the Enterprise has to disengage from the nonsense with the Pakleds and get to Starbase 515, everybody on the ship knows about it. Everybody on the starbase knows about it.
Right.
So, Picard, you really screwed up in reverse twice.
Well, like this is this is the absolute putting the cart before the horse.
Well, it's like Jean-Luc, take your ego and shove it, man.
Well,
It's
like
not good.
we just had him tell Data leave his doubts and his concerns about his image behind in his quarters a few episodes ago.
Right.
Um, and it just seems to me that the writers wrote this so they were able to get Picard off the ship with Wesley, and then
Mm-hmm.
create, I guess, this source of tension later on when he's having surgery and things turn for the worse. Which I have to say, the surgery scenes, I kind of wanted to get into those with you for a bit. You have this background in biology and you have a very good understanding of medical procedure. What did you think of Picard's heart surgery in terms of the technology they were using and just some of the things that you were hearing?
Well, I just remember, and this goes back to the original series, that Bones had something where they could put over, um, a patient when they were doing surgery. I think they referred to it as a stasis field, but it was
Right.
basically just they could create a sterile field, so they didn't have to completely glove and gown and everything. But
Hmm.
in this episode, they had, Picard under some sort of controlled environment to do the surgery, but they still, needed to present themselves as surgeons. They were gowned and capped, but they didn't have masks on. So that was a
Yeah.
little bit silly. And then, you know, the other thing is it was like, okay, if they're if they're putting a new prosthetic heart, a new artificial cardiac device into Picard's chest, it's like where the chief surgeon stood, there needs to be a pretty big opening there, and they needed to crack um, Picard's sternum and so forth, just like they do a coronary bypass uh,
Hmm.
operation now, because you're not going to be able to remove or replace a complete artificial heart through a vessel like a stent or anything like that. So
Right.
it was a little bit unrealistic to me, because if you've got the patient in some sort of controlled sterile field, what do you need to gown and glove and all that for? I mean, I can see gloves and so forth, but you know, eh, the whole scenario is a little bit, they try to make it very 24th century and so forth, but it's, it's
I
they make it a little bit too simple.
I'm surprised how how much the doctors were actually, or the specialists were actually interacting with Picard. It sometimes felt like they were putting their hands on the hole. And I would assume that in the 24th century that a lot of these surgeries, especially the more complicated stuff, like they would actually have like robotics ready to perform this for them. Like
That's a very that's a
this
very
is an
good point.
argument for like, and
Yeah,
this is actually for me an argument for androids. Like
yeah,
an android would be able to go in there and not have this issue and be able to understand, like, okay, I'm going to have to crack his sternum. I'm going to have to be able to keep his blood flow going and his brain, his brain functioning. And then I'm going to have to be able to take out this old thing and then replace it with this new thing. What, one thing that I'm curious about, they have this transporter technology where they seem to be able to do pretty exact transporter readings of where things are. One question I have is maybe they don't crack the stern because they can transport the old artificial heart out and transport a new artificial heart in, which I think would actually be, speaking from a tissue donation, and I wanted to ask you this directly. If you could actually use the transporters to take, like, let's say someone dies in a hospital, and you wanted to, and let's say in the 24th century, like, okay, let's say we're not regrowing lungs. Let's say we don't have the technology for some reason in the 24th century just to heal you completely. Let's say we're still doing transplants for some reason. Um, what? Why wouldn't they be using the transporters to transport organs from maybe whatever container it's in to whatever proper position it needs to be in the body, or vice versa? Like, let's say you take corneas and you transport them from like the lab to whatever science vessel, and that science vessel warps to whatever planet, and they beam it down to there, and the surgeon beams it onto the eye.
well, I think what the thing you're saying is would the transporter technology be precise enough that if you needed to have measurements to precisely remove, say, a defective heart in
Right.
a biologic heart and replace it with an artificial heart, could you use that using a transporter device? I mean, that's a very interesting thought. I mean, we'll just have to see whether we ever get to that point.
I'm trying to think. The reason I'm asking this is I have to imagine. Okay, so my wife Margot, Ben's mother, and your daughter-in-law is an OR nurse. So I have at least a kind of passing idea of what happens within surgery, like how gory it can be, how tough it can be, how long it can go. And also one big problem that I think surgeons face, especially like in orthopedics or neurology, is that sometimes a lot of their stuff isn't minimally invasive. And
Mm-mm.
if they could make it minimally invasive, because the less trauma you do to the body, the better. I think a lot of those surgeons would. It seems to me the technology, at least the medical technology of the future, is trying to be as minimally invasive as possible when treating a patient. The problem I see here with how they're treating Picard is that this doesn't seem minimally invasive at all. It seems like very traumatic to
I
me.
don't think there's a way that could be minimally invasive. I mean, you
You
mentioned
don't think that?
no. I
Okay.
don't. I think if you're removing a whole, uh, if they're removing a defective, uh, artificial heart, um, that as I said, that's a a fist-sized piece of machinery, and they're going to replace it with something of a similar size. When you mention
Hmm.
surgical robots, what I know about surgical robots is that they use them because their movements can be very precise,
Hmm.
and they are generally used in minimally invasive
They
procedures where
are.
they've been used, not in you know um, you're not using surgical robots when somebody comes into a shock trauma unit or a trauma
Right.
unit and so forth, because generally there's horrific wounds and so forth, and some pretty gross surgery has to be performed just to save the person, to repair the body, and so on.
Well, I will say this: you are correct in the you are correct. I think 99% of the time. I do remember instances when Margot at was working in Charlotte, and she was working in that neurology unit. That they were the shock trauma team at some
Yeah, that
points,
that was
and there would
right.
but there would be instances that they would employ their robots there, but it would be very rare, and it would be very
Yeah,
rarely done.
I think if she was doing general neurosurgery, if somebody had a tumor or something like
Yeah.
that, then that's where you probably could
Right.
use a surgical robot, because if you have a very small tumor that you want to remove from the brain, that's where there might be some ways that you would use surgical robots then, perhaps.
I think that, and I hope I'm not breaking HIPAA by saying this. I think that she was present at one surgery where they removed bullet fragments using a surgical robot from someone's brain tissue. So I think you're probably right. It wouldn't be used in an emergency situation. If I recall correctly, it was later used during like surgeries later on. But you're absolutely right. In a shock trauma unit, you and I have talked about the progress of medical science and technology throughout our long relationship together, and in many ways, it doesn't seem sometimes like we've progressed very far from the Civil War, which the level of medical technology that they had to apply on like the battlefield during the American Civil War was grotesque. Sometimes it feels like we haven't really moved past that. And maybe even in the 24th century, like you said, maybe some surgeries still require like massive operations that cause a lot of trauma.
I really think compared to the Civil War, we've advanced a lot, and I mean, even with traumatic injuries that we may have
Do
talked
you think
about
it's
this.
less bloody than it was then?
Oh, I would have to say in general, it's unless it's major trauma, yes, it's less bloody,
Interesting.
because yeah,
Okay.
it's definitely less bloody. There's ways to try to you know minimize blood loss. In many cases, there's systems even where if somebody loses a lot of blood during a major surgery, it can be captured and recycled back into the
Hmm.
patient rather than having to give them a transfusion. So
Right.
yeah, I think there's really major improvements. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Um. Well, one thing that I just thought about considering is, maybe if they still do these major surgeries that, traditionally would be very traumatic for the patient, maybe the act of replacing the heart is traumatic, but because of the level of technology, they're able to get him through the rehabilitative process and maybe through whatever therapeutic stage, in a very short amount of time.
I think that if even in the 21st century, if he had to have a major surgery like that, that there would be some rehab time, and that just because this is a story and there's a certain script,
Right.
he wouldn't be he wouldn't getting back on the Enterprise and walking to the bridge, hours after surgery and so on.
Well, this is exactly why we're having this discussion because
Yeah,
you're right. He really does get off.
yeah,
He really does walk on the bridge at the end of the thing, like, yeah, nothing's wrong. And, there is a sense of, uh, you have to suspend your disbelief, I think, with the heart
yes, you
surgery
do,
scenes
you do,
greatly.
you do exactly.
Um, so let me. So, getting away from the surgery, and I think we've covered that pretty well. Oh, there's one thing I wanted to ask you um, about the surgery one more time. And hey, Dad, can I pause real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, we're back. Sorry about that, real quick, folks. But Dad, as I was asking you, you've been in tissue transplantation and donation for a long, long time. What do you think of the idea of a synthetic or mechanical heart in the future? Do you think that that is a progressive move forward, or do you think that that is um, something critical to be looked at in terms of the 21st century technology?
I'm not up on the speed where that is, because back, I guess it was in the 90s, there was the Jarvik 7 artificial heart that
Mm-hmm.
had, limited clinical success in some patients. And now you have patients that have weak hearts that have what are called ventricular assist devices that
Mm-hmm.
basically strengthen the pumping of the heart. A lot of times, while they're on a heart transplantation list. Again, I'm not up to speed on what the R&D is to develop a truly more permanent replacement artificial heart. But I think there's probably work being done in that area
Do you think that the future is creating synthetic organs, or do you think it's growing them in labs? Because that is something that it is constantly in the news and constantly discussed in scientific circles in terms of how are we going to, in the future, possibly move away from organ harvesting and donation to possibly just creating people new artificial organs or regrowing their natural ones for them. Do
still.
you,
I think the jury's, personally, again, I have to say that I have
of
limited
course.
knowledge limited knowledge as to where things are right now. But I think it is, sort of it's up in the air. Um, I think it'd be certainly feasible to figure out how to make a biomechanical heart.
Right.
The only downside, it's going to, how would you what would the power source be? How would you recharge it? And that sort of thing. Um, and there's a lot of money and there's a lot of press, as you said, in developing tissue engineered, bioengineered organs. But that's easier said than done. It's taken
Mm-hmm.
a lot longer to develop them than anticipated, really.
Yeah.
I think one of the things to look at too, another thing is if you control antigen expression and immune response, there's a possibility that you could use xenographic organs.
Hmm.
The pig being the best. I mean, anatomically, it's very close to humans, and there's actually some companies that are doing work where they are breeding special strains or herds of pigs that are specifically have, a smaller antigenic load, or they're even genetically engineered so that they're specifically be used as a source of transplantable organs.
Do
But
you think that there is a moral or ethical issue in doing that?
I think if you have a strong animal rights perspective
Mm-hmm.
concern, then yeah, I think there would be a concern about using, pig organs, pigs specifically, it's just being created and bred specifically as a source of donor organs. I can see where some people might have serious ethical concerns about that.
Have you ever had serious ethical concerns about it?
I really haven't gotten to that point because it's not um, it's not feasible at this point. But at the same time, just thinking quickly about it is, why should I have any concerns when how many chickens, cows, lambs, and everything do we kill every year for food?
That's understandable. I think there is, I think you said it just a second ago. There's a real question about feasibility when it comes to actually dealing with some of the problems that we're facing in the world, especially when it comes to the healing and betterment of humans. Uh, I don't think when it comes to the question of organ transplantation that there is going to be any easy answer this century or in the next few centuries. I think if there's one area of medical technology or medical progress that we are going to have a hard time um, progressing in the future, you know, you and I have talked about this before. I think these mRNA vaccines really do open up a whole new world in terms of dealing with viruses and just diseases and illnesses in general. But I think when it comes to dealing with like organ health and replacing organs, I think that that is a completely different area that we're going to struggle in for a long time.
Well, and then the other important thing is, if medical science and treatment therapy advances, if we can better treat or change the way, our diets and the way we live, so that we don't get liver disease due to
Right.
too much alcohol, or a better diet so we have better cardiac health and so forth. Um, Even reduce exposure to chemicals in the environment that might be carcinogenic. If we can prevent, one of the things, and we may have talked about this before, our medicine is so geared toward treating illness after it's
Hmm.
occurred, as opposed to, let's try to prevent illness
Right.
so we don't have to, do all of these very expensive, um, um, you know, uh, corrective procedures and so forth. I mean, even if we could figure out how to treat or prevent chronic diseases such as arthritis or multiple sclerosis, things like that, um, you know, again, I think that the other way to look at organ transplantation is, if it's going to continue to be a challenge for decades, perhaps, the other way to look at it is, well, let's work on preventing diseases so that
Hmm.
people don't require organ transplants.
Well, one thing that's unique to the Star Trek universe, and this was established early on in season one, certain diseases like the common cold have basically been wiped out. I would imagine, too, considering the fact that they have all this replicated food, they are probably taking in diets that are already optimized for them versus what we eat now. Because, like you said, we put a lot of crap in our food that is just basically unhealthy. I bet you they don't have a lot of these issues in terms of the contents of their food being suspect
I
in the
would hope,
future.
yes, sure, I would hope.
Well, like,
Yep.
if it's resequenced protein, you can essentially resequence it into anything. I bet you could sequence out all the things you wouldn't want in it. too.
You would
So
think,
like,
yeah.
if you make Counselor Troy a chocolate sundae, she's going to get all the wonder and goodness and deliciousness of the chocolate, but she's not going to actually get like the sugar that's possibly going to lead to her having diabetes later, or it's not going to rot her teeth. Or I think maybe in the future they would probably go that far in terms of
I would hope.
dealing
I
with
would hope.
preventable disease. Yeah, you
Yeah,
really would though, because I think you
yeah.
make a really good point about how a lot of this stuff really in the modern day really could be preventable and we could really change healthcare, but
Hmm.
as you said, it really is in terms our medical system, especially here in the West, is really geared towards um, addressing injury and disease versus
Hmm.
preventing it.
Hmm.
Um, so before we even get to the surgery, I know we've kind of meandered a little bit. Uh, Wesley and Picard have this really, I think, wonderful conversation during their shuttle journey. And to me, this is really the center of the episode and really where the real story is taking place. The stuff with Geordi and Riker and the Pakleds is fun, but the real emotional core, I think, of the narrative here is Picard and Wesley coming to a more father and son sort of
Yes,
bond,
right.
but also us having a look at Picard not as the man we see him now, but as a man he's grown into. And I think the interesting thing about Picard we discover is the reason he has an artificial heart is because he actually used to be somewhat of a violent, foolhardy, reckless young man who got into a fight with some Nausicaans, who we will meet in a future episode, which are kind of these big, kind of barbaric, hairy aliens. But he was actually impaled through the chest during a fight, and that's why he had to have his heart replaced. And he shares this kind of very special wisdom with Wesley about, I didn't start out this disciplined and this in control. It was something that I had to develop over time through experience. And I want to kind of put a pin in that kind of idea for a second, because one thing I think the episode does very well, and I actually think it carries over from a previous episode, the Icarus Factor. One thing we see in this season a lot are the contrasts between leadership styles between Riker and Picard. And Picard's experience, I think, really allows him, when faced with genuine danger, to kind of keep his emotions in check and rise above the situation and lead decisively. Riker even identifies this as like his Persian flaw. His ability is that he can take in large amounts of information during tense, kind of catastrophic moments and make a authoritative decision. I think the contrast here is that if you look at Riker's leadership style, when the tensions kick off, he doesn't necessarily, I think, rise above the tension. I think he actually falls into the tension and flows along with it. Riker's leadership style, um, I've come to notice, is very tense, and he gets very anxious. And there's times where he's like yelling at people on the bridge during just common things, and he kind of spits orders at people. He becomes very rapid fire and very concerned and almost melancholy in a way. And I think that's you know I I'm I'm part of this Facebook group called Star Trek Shitposting, which I've discussed here many times. We share funny memes that are gross and morally bankrupt. But we had a discussion today about Riker, and one thing that I tried to point out was, you know, we watched through 7 seasons of Riker emotionally mature as an officer. There's a reason why we never see him become captain, even through the movies. And I think a lot of it has to do with his innate insecurities about himself. And I think they were revealed in the Icarus Factor. He really does want kind of this, I guess, he wants this recognition from a father figure that he is worthy. At the same time, like, he is torn between wanting to be a captain and wanting to be with Deanna, which is clearly the love of his life. And at the same time, he's a relatively young man who is being given the helm at points of the flagship of the fleet, and he is really forced to deal with some very traumatic, sometimes frightening scenarios where, he's in charge of all the away teams, so he's in charge of all the lives of the people he sends down to that planet. I think we actually see Riker through the series deal with a lot of these insecurities, and when we see them deal with them, we see a really imperfect character who progresses and I think grows, but he really is imperfect next to Jean-Luc Picard. And I think the dichotomy is really presented well here.
Yeah, you describe the dichotomy well, because when they're on the bridge and Picard's in the captain's chair and Riker's to his right, you know, when a threat comes up, Picard always stays pretty cool, but it's Riker who will say, and as you say, he puts it in a very commanding voice that red alert, shields up, you know,
Yeah.
it's actually good because it's where, you know, Picard rarely, if ever, disagrees with, you know, Riker taking those defensive steps, such as putting the shields up, going to red alert,
Right.
so on. So that's where we've talked about that they are in sync with each other very well.
Mm-hmm.
But it also shows the differences where when Picard's presented with a conundrum, with a problem, with a threat, he's very carefully thinking through it and controlling his emotions and his reaction, as where Riker is, taking over that, reactive role and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And, Worf does a lot of that too. I mean, Worf being
True.
security officer is always taking the approach that let's be cautious. Let's look at this new entity as a threat, if not an enemy,
Yes.
which is Worf doing his job. Plus, it reflects, his being a Klingon as well.
Well, I think it's important to note that, like, there is a real, one popular phrase now when it comes to, like, the difference between, like, a great athlete and a legendary athlete is a lot of people like to say there's levels. I think when it comes to, like, real leaders, there's levels at this. And you learn along the way to be a better leader, and you can, like, ascend to higher levels. But the real difference between Picard and Riker in terms of their levels of leadership is very stark at this point. And I think there's actually a point where it actually comes together and makes sense. During the films, especially Insurrection and Nemesis, Riker's left in command of the Enterprise E a lot, especially in the midst of battle. And I noticed in those movies, he's actually much calmer. He speaks in a much more controlled tone. He doesn't yell at people. He actually he actually commands a lot more like Picard does. And I think credit should be given to the writers in creating two good characters where one really does have to rely on the other. Because you're right, when they're both on the bridge together in the midst of a situation, they are in sync. But once you take away that prime ingredient that really makes things work in Picard, the beauty is that you're giving Riker, the character, a real challenge to arise to. Because one thing that we don't see, and I think it's revealed here in this conversation with Wesley, is that Picard may have been like Riker at one point. We never see him in command of the Stargazer. He could have been yelling at people and making rash decisions and, like, going with the tension of the moment instead of rising above it. And it's only after his 20 years on the Stargazer that he can walk on the bridge of the Enterprise and be like, okay, we're in the middle of Kobayashi Maru. It's Tuesday for me. you know, but you have to work up to it's Tuesday for me. And I think what we're seeing in these 7 seasons is Riker working up to that.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the films. And I think that's really as a writer, I really appreciate that. I think we should want to see characters better themselves instead of
Right.
remaining static.
Yeah.
If Riker were to remain this way through all 7 seasons, I don't think that we would like him. And I think the
Yeah.
reason why we keep liking him is because he gets better at what he does.
Right. It's a good point.
Um, but what do you think of Wesley and Jean-Luc's conversation as it becomes when it where it pertains to like the humanities as a counterpoint to having an interest in the STEM fields, which seem to be of high importance, especially in Starfleet. But Picard really takes the time to implore Wesley to, like, really study the arts and really study the humanities and find a passion in life outside of, just the nuts and bolts of things. Um, what do you think of his reflections on those topics? And
I thought it was just an important comment, and it reflects that obviously the emphasis with the Starfleet test for cadets is very much science based, STEM, and so forth. But Picard, as he has grown, um, and at his age and so forth, he really is. Since he's not married, he's dedicated to his life
hmm
um, to Starfleet. He's rounded himself very well. I mean, he really is, in a sense, a Renaissance man,
true,
and
very
and
much so.
so he gives good advice to Wesley, that don't forget the humanity side, because it balances you out in terms of being able to understand, project yourself into situations and make decisions.
hmm
It's sort of like the thing we've talked about before, is that medical schools don't want all of their med students to be science majors.
Yeah.
They'll have people that have degrees in history or degrees in psychology, as long as they have some basic science, like organic chemistry and basic
hmm
biology and things like that, because it brings in a different perspective into medicine and uh, so on. And
Right.
I think it's sort of an important consideration in 2021, because the struggle, I think education um, in this country right now is a mess, and it's a real struggle to figure out how to do it, at all, whether it's in a charter
Oh
school, a
yeah.
public school, a private school, all this sort of thing. And there's so much interest and emphasis on science, technology, electronics, STEM, and so forth, that and there's been sort of a de-emphasis to some sense on the humanities, because if you're an English major, you're a history major, how are you going to get a job? But
Oh,
those humanities, those disciplines are very important to us as humans still. And and,
passionately stated.
and
Yeah.
it's one of these things where, I mean, you know, maybe educational things, well, we need more science teachers for biology and physics and math, but yeah, but you also need the English teachers and the Spanish teachers and the history and so forth, so that civics, even, so that people, as they're coming out of high school and going into college, they understand how society works. And you have to have a historical sense in order to put things into context in terms of what's happening now.
Absolutely
Why are
correct.
things now, and what happened 10 years from now, 20 years ago, 50 or 100 years ago, that are causative in terms of and relative to why things are the way they are now. People need that perspective. Scientists and engineers need that perspective.
Absolutely. Passionately argued, and I couldn't agree more. But the one thing that I would add to that is, um, and Ben, you will probably not know this until you hear this, because I don't know if this will come up in conversation between us. But at one point, I actually went to graduate school for secondary education with the idea that I was going to be teaching history in high school. I would have done this in North Carolina, which means I would have gotten my North Carolina teaching license there. one of the reasons I decided to leave grad school and not pursue this, and ultimately ended up in sci-fi and fantasy publishing. Um, One of the things that happened the semester before I left was North Carolina decided to end of course testing in history and social studies for all the students, and basically we're going to peel back a lot of the social studies instruction within North Carolina public schools, um, for the plain and simple reason that they did not want a critical view of history taught when it came to American politics and culture. It's funny that we're talking in July of 2021 about critical race theory, because I could tell you back in 2013, schools were already trying to stamp out any sort of critical discussion or view of history in general, because I had gone through the Padea course in high school, and a lot of people don't realize that like North Carolina public schools ended up not liking Padea because they ended up getting a bunch of mouthy, rebellious kids who weren't going to take this adult shit anymore when it came to the economy and politics. You know, we were ready to vote when we came out of that shit because we understood and we were taught by our teachers, and I should give credit to some really wonderful teachers, including um, Susan Pearson and Robert Dietrich, Coach Thomas, and I can't remember the other lady's name, and I love her to death, and I'm so sorry about this, but I can't remember you, ma'am, at the moment. I can remember your face, but I can't remember your name. Um, but they really prepared us with a real world education that we were able to at least look at the world and understand that there were different viewpoints. When I was going through grad school, they were in the midst of stripping those, especially when it came to history. And the first way that they do that is that they take the onus off kids having to learn it by making it not a requirement for testing. There's no requirement for kids to understand history or even really understand English. I have to say it's not only just taking away the testing, but when they were testing them in general, they weren't doing anything really qualitative to figure out if kids had really understood the material or integrated in a way that it meant anything to their worldview.
Well, there was one thing I learned from my Uncle Joe Schreiber, who was a PhD geologist at
Right.
University of Arizona and passed away several years ago. He told me he always had, an English book on proper English syntax and writing and grammar and so forth, because he said if you're going to be a scientist and you want to communicate your discoveries or your theories and so forth to your colleagues, you have to know how to write well.
Right.
So he kept these grammar books and English books on hand, and I think he would actively refer to them when he was writing a paper or writing a chapter
Oh,
in a
yeah.
textbook and so on.
Well, one of the best things that I got out of my humanities education really was the ability to write. There were so many things that, like high school and even early on in college, that I was not taught about writing until I went through history and religious studies training. In terms of speaking an active voice, how to actually structure arguments, what primary sources are versus secondary resources, and how you measure them, how you actually handle information, how you actually determine whether it's misinformation or not. A lot of history instruction is teaching you about how to review information for the possibility that it could be lying to you. And I think that there is a pointed reason why the state of North Carolina is trying to remove this sort of instruction from public schools. I really do think that they are trying to inhibit children from being able to see the world in ways that are unique to them and instead adhere to. I don't want to bring like books like Brave New World or 1984 into this, but just as the left can be Huxleyan, the right is very Orwellian sometimes in terms of how they
There
try
have
to.
been there have been several articles in the Raleigh News and Observer in the last several days about what the Republican legislature wants to pass laws to prohibit teaching of critical race
Right.
theory. And the articles talk about, is this going to lead to a witch hunt on teachers? Because if
Yes.
a teacher talks about racial issues, and not even terms of critical race theory, is somebody going to, hear what they say or interpret what they say and say, look, they're just doing a sub rosa critical race theory teaching, and this person needs to be disciplined. They need to be fired. They're breaking the law. And
Right.
it's
Well,
bad.
it's almost as it's almost as bad as McCarthy, and but if anything, it's far more damaging and insidious because it won't be taking place in the actual halls of power. It'll be taking place within schoolrooms, and it'll be taking place in front of our children, and it'll be taking place in front of people who have no idea what's going on because these decisions weren't made for them.
Right.
One thing that really, and we'll move on after this. One thing that truly bothers me about the state of education, especially here in the West, is that it doesn't actually deal with any honest realities. Like, we're not teaching anything, even in the sciences, in my opinion, when it comes to the real, like, human impacts that things like climate change and some of the political sectarianism that we see across the globe. We're not teaching well enough the true impacts of these things. And the primary example of this should be seen in January 6th. Um, I do not want to make an apocalyptic warning, but Hitler, I think it was in 1932, tried during the Beer Hall Putsch, I
It's
believe,
1923.
1923. Um, right, 1923. Hitler in 23 tried to stage a coup and failed. Not too many years afterwards, he was elected to the chancellorship of Germany and then began his long reign of terror where he basically stripped out the German soul and replaced it with tyranny and destruction and racial hatreds. Um, we are living in a scenario where that can happen again. One of the things that the Nazis did when they were able to get any sort of representative power in government, because we have to remember Germany was a democracy and the Nazis were voted in. Um, we have to remember the first thing that they did was try to change the things that German children were instructed on when it came to their own history. And later on, when they came into power, and we must always remember this: tyrants hate the truth. There's a reason why they burned books. They burned books because the truth revealed what they were. And I do not. If there's any conservatives listening to this, I want you to understand that I'm not targeting you, and Jake is not necessarily targeting you when we say this, but we need to have a standard of truth so children can find their way in the world. And when we take these avenues of discovering truth away from them, especially avenues that are willfully being presented in ways that are misinformed and are being presented in ways to confuse and obscure, we are doing greater harm to the future of this country, the future of society, and the future of our world. We need to give children as many different perspectives as possible and let them decide on their own if we truly believe they are worthy of things like freedom and independence, and most importantly, the things that make those first two work: responsibility. If we really want to believe that children are responsible, we should be able to trust them with the truth. And I'll move on from that.
Right.
So I think
One,
that we've. Sorry, go on.
now, the one thing that I think we need to discuss is actually the title of the episode, "The Samaritan Snare,"
Right.
because there's two aspects to that in terms of the two of the three stories is, first of all,
Two stories.
the
I made the mistake
right,
of
two
saying there was
stories.
three.
We talked, in previously, what role does the enterprise have? Is
Right.
it the Navy? Is it a diplomatic ship? Is it an exploring ship? Is it a science vessel? Is it the Coast Guard? In this case,
Right.
they're acting as the Coast Guard.
Right.
And they get, because they're being a good Samaritan as the Coast Guard, they get snared into this events with the Pakleds and so on. The other sort of Samaritan stare that gets into it also, which kind of interlinks, but it's not as strong, is that they have to end up figuring out how to quickly get out of their dilemma with the Pakleds because they have to go do another major Samaritan mission, which is saving their captain to get Dr.
Yeah.
Pulaski, as we discussed before.
Right.
Jean-Luc set it up, to hurt himself and so forth because of his pride. So, I think it's important to just talk about that in relative to the title of the episode.
Oh, I think that I think the interesting thing about Samaritans and being a good Samaritan is in the nature of doing good versus doing evil. Because the Packledge are doing evil in this episode by kidnapping Jordy because they think he is going to be able to build them better weapons and defensive technology. Because they already have a warp drive and they already have Romulan shields, but they think he's going to be able to give them torpedoes. Or at least that's what the storyline kind of plays out. I think it is honestly harder, and this is an argument that I think a lot of people get really uncomfortable with sometimes. I think it is harder to actually be a good person and do good things than it is to be a shit person and do shit things. The world is set up, um, unfortunately, I think, to reward shitty behavior easier than it is set up to reward good behavior. And I think part of that is like the lesson of the Samaritan itself. The Samaritan serves without expectation of reward or expectation of pleasure or expectation of any real reciprocity. The reciprocity for the Samaritan is actually doing a good deed for the sake of doing a good deed and for the sake of helping others. Um, I think that leads people like that and to be easily trapped by those that would take advantage of those people because they know they're out there. Um, it doesn't surprise me that there is a race of aliens out there going and kidnapping people and then trying to ransom them off for things. If you go to places like Brazil, one thing that is very dangerous about Brazil, especially in places like Sao Paulo, if you're in traffic, you need to keep your windows up and you need to not look at anybody because there are people on bikes and mopeds that are zipping between the cars on the streets, and someone on those mopeds might be riding on the back behind the driver of that moped, and they might pull up to your window and they might pull out a gun and they might rob you right then and there, and the driver too. And the driver might even be in on it. The point I'm trying to make is that, there are places in this world and there are people in this world that are geared to take advantage of us. But thankfully, there's also people in this world like the crew of the Enterprise, be they bound by intergalactic law or a sense of duty to themselves, that are willing to sit out there and actually do the work of helping people when times are tough and when the emergency rises. We watch this crew fly into pandemics, ecological disasters, wars, conflicts, um, and they do it for very little thanks. It's their job. Like, how many episodes have we seen Jean-Luc Picard
Oh,
settle intergalactic disputes when honestly it's not their business?
well, I'm glad you went down that pathway because I was going to say they get into situations like that and they find themselves in situations where they decide that there's a moral obligation to try to make things better. And in several cases, as we know, it puts them in conflict with the prime directive.
Absolutely. Well, the Prime Directive is kind of built on the idea that you should avoid these kind of Good Samaritan things. Because, you know, there is more difficulty. It's what I said before. There's actually more difficulty in being truly good and moral than there is not. And I think even the Prime Directive is making the argument that if you see something wrong, if they're not a warp capable race and you don't have contacts with them already, let the bad thing happen. It's not your concern. It's not your place to play God. But at the same time, we all have, I think, and especially Samaritans, have a sense of moral and ethical duty in them to do the right thing when they see something going wrong. We see this in the last episode with the Pen Pals, where, like, even Picard, with the Prime Directive as being almost holy writ to him, here's a little girl pleading to be saved in the dark, and he goes and rescues that little girl knowing that there's huge risks involved. If he was a villain, he wouldn't care. And if he was just a normal person, there's a there's a possibility he wouldn't care there too either. There's a lot of people that walk past the homeless every day, and we're both guilty of that. We're all guilty of that. And the truth is, if we were really good moral people, we would all stop and say, like, there's something wrong with this person being left out here like this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the reason we don't is because we're kind of bred by the society and we're bred by our culture to not hold that person's human dignity at the highest value above things like wealth and hoarded treasures and, our own material existence. I think the beautiful thing about the future and having a group like the crew of the USS Enterprise D is that it seems they have a culture of that. Like, it is our duty to go out there. And part of us being bettering ourselves as human beings or bettering ourselves as an intergalactic community is going out there and trying to better others by being there for them. I think there is. I think you're right. I think that there is an interesting conundrum when it comes to being a Samaritan. On one hand, you're dedicating yourself to trying to do honest good when you see wrong, but at the same time, you're opening yourself up to having wrong done to you. Am I
Yes.
off base here, or do you have any
No.
reflections on this?
No. I totally agree with what you said.
Um, I will say before we go, the end of the episode really is kind of it kind of fizzles out because they do just leave the Pakleds there, and who knows what did the Pakleds do? Just fly off and
Yeah.
I guess con someone else for another day.
Yeah. I guess that's it.
But I think that we've had a good episode here. Before we go, Dad, once again, where do you think this ranks in terms of season two, and uh, how do you feel in general about it?
I'd give it like a 5.5 in
Yeah,
the
I
middle.
think
In
that's
the
fair.
middle.
Like
Yeah.
it's a good, solid episode, but it's not
Right.
anything great.
Right. Right.
I do have to say though that this is probably one of the more iconic episodes. A lot of people point back to this one for like the comedy value of it. The
Hmm.
Packers are really funny to people.
They are.
But
Absolutely are.
on that, we will close
Actually, I
off for
just thought,
tonight.
what
Oh,
would be a good Halloween costume is to go as a Pakled. No, but
oh,
if you
that
went,
wouldn't be bad.
no one would. You'd have to explain, in their very curt way of talking and so forth, the incomplete
We,
sentences,
we
what
are
you are. And so
smart.
we
Yeah,
are smart.
yeah. I
Exactly.
that would be a lot of fun. So on that note, we will conclude for tonight. Please come back and join us next time for Star Trek Next Generation Season 2. I believe we're at episode 18, Up the
Yes.
Long Ladder.
Yes.
Okay, well,
All right.
Dad, thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you
Thanks,
soon.
Jay. All right. Good
Night.
night. Bye bye now.